Hello and welcome to The Digital Insight, the technology, procurement and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those who are leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to The Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO strategy and interface magazines. Will COVID-19 be the tipping point for digital transformation in procurement? Well, that was the question asked by Ivalua as part of a recent study, and it's also the question that Alex Saric, CMO of Ivalua, sits down to explore with me in today's episode. We also look at whether COVID-19 has propelled the digital procurement conversation forward or held it back as organizations look at cutting costs during uncertain times. And we also ask, what will become of the traditional supplier relationship model? And what role will digital solutions continue to play in defining this relationship model of the future? Alex, welcome to the Digital Insight. So I always like to ask our guests, just so that our listeners can learn a little bit more about you before we dive into any sort of hot topics, as to who you are and what your experience is, in your kind of career journey. And particularly looking at it from, as we speak about procurement today, what your experience looking at procurement is. So if you give us a bit of an overview then of your kind of journey to where you are today with Ivalua.
Sure, happy to do that. So my name is Alex Saric, and I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Ivalua, which is a leading spend management software provider. I spent almost 20 years in different leadership roles in the spend management industry. I've run product, I've run delivery, more recently marketing. It's been a great opportunity. I've been able to work with hundreds of customers at different points of their own transformations, and it's been a great opportunity to have a front row seat and see a lot of the transformation that's been taking place in procurement.
Excellent. So as we speak today, then we're looking at obviously what's happening right now in terms of procurement, digital transformation, and of course what's happening with COVID-19. Before we dive into that a bit more, then one thing that we talk about a lot on this podcast, and we talk a lot and cover in our features in the magazine, is we look at digital transformation and how much, in terms of procurement, that conversation has changed in recent years, how it's become more than simply a buzz phrase, but to some people it still is a buzz phrase. So there's very different opinions. Prior to what's happening right now with COVID-19, sum up as best as you can where that conversation was. Where were we when talking about procurement transformation from a digital transformation standpoint?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a lot of effort, especially by larger organizations, but also by a good bit of more mid-size on digitally transforming procurement. I think the reality, unfortunately, is the results have been pretty mixed. And overall, I'd say relatively poor progress. We worked to get kind of a broader view with Forrester to do a survey last year and found that less than 50% of respondents had managed to achieve even 25% digitization across any of their source-to-pay processes, 3/4 less than half. So overall, there hasn't been tremendous progress, but there's been a lot of talk about it. That said, there's a huge disparity. There are definitely some advanced organizations out there that are walking the talk, as you will, and are far ahead of their competitors. We've been fortunate to count a lot of them as our customers. Companies we work with like Crédit Agricole in France or CACI in the United States, Covéa, they've achieved virtually 100% digitization. And they're giving their businesses a big advantage. So it absolutely is possible. But I'd say to date, there's been a lot of talk and some good efforts, but not a tremendous amount of progress by the average organization.
And it's interesting because, like I say, we speak to, and I speak to a lot of people who talk about transformation, and you're absolutely right. The talk is there. The appetite is there for digital transformation. But like you say, the progress just isn't matching up to that appetite. What, again, prior to COVID-19, what would you say, and based on research that you've done and people you've spoken to, stand out as some of the biggest hurdles or the biggest challenges and roadblocks for this progressing in a digital transformation?
We've had a good overview because I think most of our customers, and I think we may be unique, have actually worked with some other technology and struggled or hit roadblocks along the way. So we've had some good observations into that. I'd say the high level first. The core problem that we've seen is too many organizations have taken a very short-term view, and the decisions they've made regarding their people, their technology, has kind of held them back. They want to get some quick wins and maybe improve sourcing savings, or they're focused on improving the experience for users. So they make choices with a very narrow focus on that. Then when they're ready to move to more processes to capture more of their spend, they hit a wall. And what we've really seen is that the obstacles that they face, they vary at each stage of their transformation. It's important to keep that in mind. So very early on, the biggest issue we've seen is actually companies, it's been a human one, it's lack of executive support at the right levels of the organization. It's key to have that alignment on the importance and the goals, transforming procurement, including balanced KPIs, so people are incented to do the right thing. When they get past that, then it's become more of a technology issue. And the big factor that we've seen is adoption by both suppliers and users. A lot of talk on users, but actually what we've seen is the number one obstacle companies have hit is supplier adoption, making sure that your provider makes it easy, that you don't impose any kind of restrictions, fees. It's really key there. And we have companies, Maxim Healthcare, great example. For 7 years, they struggled to try to digitize P2P and had major pushback from suppliers because the network had fees in their case. Then when they switched to a different technology that didn't have those type of controls or limitations, in 8 weeks they were up and had more suppliers enabled. So it's a big factor. User adoption is the other one that's really critical. And it gets a lot of focus, and it is important. But I think a lot of times the focus is really about, okay, is it just a nice, slick interface? And that matters. But it's also important to make sure that you've got the content there and that you can mask organizational complexity, which most big organizations have. Credit Suisse is a great example in Europe. They had users that had to select from a long list of accounting codes anytime they wanted to make a purchase. And it was extremely complex and inaccurate. But by kind of building in a guided buying wizard that masked that complexity and automatically assigned it, that complexity is still there, but users don't see it. It's invisible. And then lastly, for companies that really get past and start getting high levels of digitalization, they really want to be advanced and drive a competitive advantage to the organization. There we start seeing there's a mix of human issues on having people that are resistant to doing things differently, the change management. And from a technology, that's where they really start having issues if they don't have integration across their source to pay suite, where they need the data to flow seamlessly and have better access to insights. So the obstacles vary, but they've been pretty consistent depending on where organizations are.
And how important is it to, as much as we obviously want to champion successes and as much as we hear more about successful implementation, the savings made here, the digital implementation made there, how important is it for us to still make sure that we take some real learnings from these challenges, that we don't just brush them over and say, well, that's a failure there, or that's something that didn't really work out, let's move on. But we actually stop and take stock because these challenges are consistent, these obstacles are consistent. How important is it to make sure that we are taking the right lessons from these obstacles?
I think it's really critical. And that's really the key to success is there are fortunately so many organizations that have already progressed or tried and hit obstacles. We know, or at least anyone that's been working with a lot of companies knows what the challenges typically are. And there are great examples. I mean, you can learn from the vendors, from service providers, from peers that have gone through it. That's really the key. And what we've really found is companies that struggled, and then they understand the lessons in their approach, they're so much more successful the second time. So if you can do that up front, and rather than deal with the pain and have to learn from it, it's going to make the journey a lot more pleasant.
And obviously then, to flip that on its head, and look at successes and focus on successes in not just in procurement, but in most sort of industries and most sort of functions and areas. When we look at sort of journeys like this, or we look at transformations and we look at successes, we tend to look at the bigger names, the bigger companies, because if they're doing it, then anyone can do it. In that kind of approach. Again, based on your experience, based on the conversations you've had. In recent years, what have been some of the kind of standout successes that really have defined the digital procurement conversation?
So if you look at specific companies, I mean, there are a lot out there, and they differ because they have different priorities. But maybe to just mention a couple of them, Meritor is an automotive company, global, but based in the U.S. I think they're a great example of a success. It's an organization that had a board-level mandate to really accelerate innovation, improve margins, and grow revenues. And the procurement and supply chain function was really instrumental to that from day one. They had very balanced objectives along those lines, and really their core strategy was to digitize and improve their collaboration with suppliers. So they actually digitized the entire product and supplier lifecycle. And as a result, they actually really helped the company multiply the stock price relative to peers. So a huge impact on the organization. They accelerate innovation. What I particularly like about it is that often when we talk about digital transformation, it's focused very much on the transactional aspect. But in their case, they really digitized a lot of the areas that are much more strategic, launching new products, selecting suppliers, collaborating with suppliers, assessing suppliers for risk, areas that typically are harder to digitize, but they've done it successfully. I'll stick with the same industry, but if we flip over to Europe, Chassis Brakes International is another great example that I like, and a very different approach, but they're a very global, decentralized organization. And they struggle to work closely with the suppliers just because their supplier data was all over the place. They were making local decisions. So they took an approach of focusing on the data first. They implemented, a source-to-pay suite that had integrated vendor master data management capabilities. And the first thing they did was get control of that data. And they had 25 global SAP instances. They unified everything, in their case through Ivalua, got control of their data, enabled real 360-degree visibility. They then rationalized their supply base. They realized they had too many. And with the remaining suppliers, they greatly improved the level of collaboration. And that actually drove significant savings on both the indirect and the direct side. So those are a couple examples. There are a lot more, but I want to be conscious of time.
And as we talk about, digital transformation, the digitization of procurement, solutions, tools, a lot of people will say a lot of different things, but a lot of the same things, which sometimes then means, well, is that just another buzz phrase? Is another buzzword even? Is that technology really bringing any value, or are you just saying it because other people are talking about it? So again, a broad question, but I always like to kind of drill down as to say, what are kind of, if you had to pick 2-3 key technologies that actually have real value and have been shown to have real value, what would they be, as opposed to just people saying, well, we're investing in the AI space or we're investing in the cloud space? What are the real technologies with the real value?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's been so much buzz in the market and hype around certain technologies. I mean, recently, especially, I'd say AI, RPA, blockchain. But if you look at the real success stories, they're actually not the technologies that have been driving them today. Now, don't get me wrong, some like AI in particular are already having an impact. And we're a big believer. We have a whole team focused on AI, and we've built a universal chatbot that improves the experience and a lot of things there. And they're going to make more of an impact in the future. But today, the success stories that you look at have really been driven more by advancements in source-to-pay suites. And in particular, having a truly integrated suite where everything is truly seamless across it. The suites have advanced greatly. They can then drive extreme levels of automation that helps free up capacity, so procurement has time for all these new objectives. Improve the access to insights so people can access information wherever they are and make real-time or much more informed decisions. And then connecting suppliers and stakeholders from a project management perspective to collaborate on all these new initiatives. This has actually been the real driver of the biggest stories that we've seen out there. The Meritor example that I pointed out, it's a great example of doing exactly that. And it really came down to having the suite. Even the chassis brake example, it was having everything integrated. So they had a seamless flow of information. They can collaborate, work together on projects. That's really been the key to date. And I'd say, the other area where there have been a lot of improvements is more tailored capabilities. A lot of organizations have a unique structure. There are certain industries that have very unique requirements. There have been great improvements in recent years in more tailored capabilities. So I feel that we moved from, if you look at the manufacturing mindset and the industrial revolution, from the CD world where everything was custom but very costly, to mass production, and you got it cheaper and faster, but it only met 80% of your requirements, and to where now we moved with like 3D printing and manufacturing towards more mass tailoring of requirements. And I think the technologies move the same way. That now you're seeing a lot of the cloud-based capabilities made it faster and easier and were great, but they didn't quite meet all the requirements. They've been tailored and can be more configurable. So if you're a healthcare provider and you have a very unique process for the items that you buy in the operating room, as opposed to laptops and other items, you can actually digitize that. If you're in the public sector, if you're a manufacturer, you have some very unique requirements. So a lot of the industry solutions are really helping companies drive not just savings, but a lot of these more strategic benefits to the organization.
So let's address then what's happening in the world right now with COVID-19. Obviously, of course, it's having a huge impact, huge disruption on obviously, human life, but also on businesses and economic, and particularly when we talk to people recently, we're looking to explore how the supply chain and the procurement space has been affected. Now, I know Ivalua has recently released, the results of a study that sort of asked the question as to whether COVID-19 will represent a tipping point for digital transformation in procurement. And looking at that research, then, one of the figures is that 7 in 10 UK organisations believe COVID-19 has increased the need for digital transformation in procurement. And obviously, I'm keen to look at this a little bit more because we already talked about the sort of digital transformation of procurement and the conversation around it. Looking at this study, and looking at where we are now, then, has the procurement transformation conversation been brought forward? Are people demanding it, expecting it? Has the appetite increased now? Or has it sent the conversation backwards a little bit because of the disruption and the difficulty of what's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, any type of a crisis, it's often the flip side is that actually generates some needed change. But there are some risks. If you look at a crisis like COVID-19 that creates huge top-line pressures for the business, they're always dangerous for procurement because they can shift the focus back to cost, protecting the bottom line. And that will be a big setback for procurement as they've been moving to more strategic initiatives and ways to help the organization. But I don't view that to really be the case this time. I mean, first, I think there are enough leaders out there that have realized and in many cases proved the more strategic value of procurement and the many ways it can help, and are going to be very resistant to any slip backwards. But more importantly, I'd say, COVID has actually highlighted just how strategic procurement is and managing spend and suppliers effectively. It's not just the top line pressure that businesses are struggling with today. Continuity of supply challenges highlighted just how important strong supplier relationships and visibility into the full supply chain are. The cash flow issues highlight the importance of collaborating with suppliers and having visibility into and control over their payments. Ensuring workers are productive at home shows how important digital processes are. These and other big challenges are on the front page of news sites every day. And I feel that procurement's one of the heroes of the crisis and clearly has a very balanced set of marching orders to go out. So some organizations are digital laggards, and I think they're feeling the pain. So I think we're going to see an acceleration and a highlighting of just how important it is for procurement to be strategic and to digitally transform to enable them to actually carry out all these new objectives.
Yeah. And sort of explain that a little bit further then about, how this sort of technology laggards. One thing that always baffles me, and I find myself surprised more and more sometimes, is that here, even now in 2020, when I speak to certain people, that there are some people who still have a little bit of inherent reluctance to invest in tech. There's still a fear, there's still a kind of, it seems a bit of a costly risk. And looking at obviously the study, and the study says that organizations believe that greater digitalization and better digital skills will enable them to more effectively mitigate the impact of COVID, and as you've just been touching upon then. So in terms of, again, that kind of integrity of procurement, in terms of how that's in recent years become more strategic, people have become more aware of what it is, has that also changed the mindset? So anybody who might be fearful or reluctant of technology now kind of, for lack of a better turn of phrase, doesn't have an excuse not to be doing that anymore.
Absolutely. And I'll give you a great example from just a couple of weeks ago, and from the public sector, which has definitely been in the spotlight since the crisis struck. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, they used to accept all their bids via paper, which is not unusual in a lot of public sector organizations. But then with workers actually having to be at home during the lockdown, their ability to keep procurement flowing and was really severely curtailed. So they finally brought in Ivalua, and we digitized their vendor and solicitation processes very quickly. Actually deployed the system in 1 week to get the critical processes up and running. Now that's actually spurred them, and they're looking at a broader digital transformation because they realize how critical it is. And we know the same thing is happening in a lot of organizations. What seemed like a nice to have has turned into a must have in many cases virtually overnight. So I'm sure there are probably some holdouts out there, but it's a much smaller group because anyone that hadn't made advances in the past has certainly been feeling the pain.
And looking elsewhere then at the study, some of the biggest challenges that organizations have identified that they face while mitigating the impact of COVID-19 are often ones that you tend to hear championed in previous years in terms of one of the challenges is an overdependence on a limited set of suppliers, or there's a challenge in trying to identify alternate suppliers. There's even a lack of understanding in terms of suppliers' risk exposure, as well as sort of a lack of visibility into tier 2 or even tier 3 suppliers. Overall, the belief and the message is that supplier visibility has completely changed. The focus around it has completely changed, with digitalization being seen as I don't want to use that phrase, a silver bullet, but digitalization really will improve that visibility. So essentially then, to strip that back to its kind of core, the supplier relationship model is completely different. With more visibility means that these companies now have to change that supplier model and the way they handle those relationships. Again, I know it's quite broad, but just tell me what you've seen on that front. Tell me what you've seen about the conversations you've had where people now look at the way they work with suppliers entirely different than they would have done, just 3 to 4 months ago. And is this going to be a permanent change? Is this going to be a new, I don't want to say new normal, but is that going to be the new approach to supplier relationship moving forward?
Now, I wouldn't actually say that the COVID crisis has transformed the supplier relationship model as a whole. I think that'd be doing a discredit to so many organizations that have already been working with suppliers in different ways in the past. A lot of the trends that we're seeing now were really in flight before the crisis. The suppliers were already becoming and had become more important as more and more of the business was outsourced and longer, more global supply chains increased the importance of having visibility, including into the sub-tier suppliers. Companies like Chassis Brake had already transformed before the crisis in terms of how they engage suppliers. But COVID is definitely having a big impact. First, it's making a lot of these new behaviors, as well as the digitization must-haves. It's also causing a rethink, I think, in many cases, on how to structure supply chains. And I think it's pretty well known in the past, there's been a big shift towards offshoring, especially to China, to minimize costs. But with all the suppliers, or in many cases, the sub-tier having exposure to China, many organizations, the crisis hit a lot of companies badly. So I think the sustainable impact is going to be on having more diversified supply chains with closer relationships with your existing suppliers, visibility into their suppliers. And I do think that digitalization of more processes is going to become the norm, ensuring that work can continue regardless of kind of where the employees are and they can still engage. So I view it as widening the past trend and accelerating it. But again, I think it would be doing a disservice to say it's really changed it, because we know so many organizations that had already changed their approach or well on their path prior to the crisis.
Yeah. And sort of along the same lines, in a previous episode, we sort of touched upon that sort of rather candidly, of course, but it was touched upon, and the belief was that for many, any preconceived notions as to what procurement is, in terms of what digital transformation means to procurement, in terms of what strategic procurement means, they said you might as well throw those away, because from now on, we're almost starting from scratch. This is going to be, and to sort of your point, it's not necessarily going to be completely new, but it's going to be new directions for many people. Is that something you agree with? Do you agree that, while not necessarily we're tearing the rule books up and we're writing a new rule, a new order for what procurement can be, but this is definitely going to define it in a new way for many people?
I think it definitely will. And we're not sure exactly which way it's going to go. I like the old saying, the only thing certain in life is uncertainty. I think it definitely is relevant for procurement. The functions changed so much just in the past decade. I can't be quite sure what it's going to look like, but I'm quite confident it's going to be different. I mean, personally, I think in the future, procurement is going to be much leaner, more strategic, and almost kind of using technology as their cockpit, where they pull different levers based on different priorities and policies and new requirements, rather than the much more of a transactional focus they've had in the past. Now, at the same time, one of the predictions floating around and concerns related to digitization naturally strikes a bit of fear is that is the function to be automated to the point of extinction? I've heard some people point that out. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think it's really only possible if procurement leaders don't step up to demonstrate the value they can unlock from spending suppliers. I like to think that there's no reason to fear uncertainty unless you're just passively sitting by and letting it shape you. But I do think that there's so many great leaders out there. They have the courage and the vision that I think procurement's going to have a really bright future. And again, I think it's going to be much more strategic. It's going to be the person behind the scenes, pulling the levers and making sure that the spend and suppliers are supporting the company's overall business objectives. I think it's an exciting time for those that are open to change and eager to it.
Yeah. And you touch upon a key point there that I like to sort of ask everybody is about how I think when this first started, not when it first started happening, but obviously as the impact started to spread and people started to sort of really see what it would do for business, that I think people kind of turned inward and didn't really want to sort of talk about themselves and their businesses because they were sort of focusing too much on, and rightly so, on trying to kind of not only survive as a business, but kind of thrive. And as we've reached this point, I'm now starting to see more and more people are keen to explore and highlight the positive stories and successes, no matter how big or how small they are. People are keen to shout and say, hey, look, this works and this worked for us and it should work for everyone else. Is that something you agree with? Do you think, while yes, it can be so easy to focus on the very clear and obvious sort of negative stuff that's happening, let's use it also as an opportunity to really champion ourselves and really talk about what we have been doing right and what we will continue to do right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an area that procurement has historically not been very good at. The procurement leaders are usually not great marketers, but it's so critical to ensure that the organizational support's there for real transformation. It's a big reason why I try to call out and point out as many examples as I can whenever I'm talking to anyone. But the benefits and impact being had, it's not just theoretical. Leaders are actually driving the results today. But you look at sustainability with IKEA and their supply chain, Group ADP in France, having huge impacts on their CSR ratings and overall sustainability. You can pick any objective, and there are great stories out there. With the current crisis, ability to find new sources of supply and quickly shift. It's remarkable. There have been so many stories about toilet paper shortages and all these other types of shortages going on. But really, the exciting story is how rare the shortages have been, how almost everything that we rely on has pretty much still been available. The shortages have been the unusual exception. They make the headlines. And it's key to focus on that because it doesn't happen automatically. There was a tremendous amount of work, both now during the crisis, but also before, kind of transforming procurement and supply chain functions to be able to be more agile. We have to call those out because otherwise you're just not going to get the same credibility and honestly, the pan of act that so many leaders deserve.
And you raise a very important and key point there about how, and I've sort of, again, phrased it candidly before, no one knows procurement like procurement, but when it comes to other parts of the business and other people in general, they might not have a clear picture as to what procurement is. And like you say, there's been quite a challenge in terms of where procurement hasn't been very good at kind of marketing itself and sort of making more people aware. It takes a company like Ivalua to sort of almost kick people into gear and say, look, this is a really great story. Let's sing it from the rooftops. What work do you do on that front? Obviously, you do a lot of work with companies, you help them. But what do you do in terms of essentially marketing those stories for other people to see?
Yeah, and this is a very mutually beneficial area because obviously we like to promote our brand. We like to show what we're doing for our customers together. At the same time, customers, they deserve credit for what they've done because nothing happens by default. You don't just implement the technology and realize all the benefits. There's always hard work that goes on the human side. So our approach has really been, for as long as I can remember, certainly in the years I've been here, is to focus most of our marketing programs on thought leadership, sharing those stories, publishing case studies, getting our customers in front of media to tell their stories themselves rather than ourselves doing it. I think that's really essential for any vendor, and it's a key role that we play is to get the visibility for the people that are really driving great things.
And my final question for you is one that I like to ask a lot of people in when I bring them on is one in terms of advice, and I don't mean necessarily advice. Tell me your secret to succeeding. What? Because obviously there's no guarantee of success, but obviously prior to now, procurement has always been and quite a complex and constantly shifting space. And obviously now that's only sort of multiplied a lot. So my question then really is, if someone was to come to you or someone was to ask for one piece of advice, they are in the midst of a digital transformation of their procurement function, they're currently mulling over it, or they've got a lot of decisions to make, and they don't really know how to begin it or how to kind of proceed in a way that will, like I say, not necessarily guarantee success, but that will help steer them in the right track. What would you say? What would be one piece of advice you would give?
Yeah, I always emphasize to be ambitious. It's fine to take small steps along the way, but don't just focus on those immediate needs, but really think about what you aspire the procurement function to be. Don't limit yourself to just implementing standard best practices. That's great, and it's a wonderful short-term goal, but the longer term should be, what can I do to turn my spend and supplier relationships into a competitive advantage? What can I do strategically different than competitors are doing now? And then map out the transformation. It is a journey. So map out the steps and then find the people and the technology that's going to support you for each step of the way, realizing that the obstacles and the requirements are going to differ at each stage. So make sure you have the long-term vision and make sure it is ambitious, and then map out a clear path to get you there with some very achievable objectives along the way to build a business case. And I find the leaders that do that are very likely to succeed. The ones that are very focused and perhaps overwhelmed with their immediate challenges, they may address them, but then they're going to hit a roadblock and they're not going to realize their potential later on.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you for joining me.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with the Interface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/The Digital Insight.